The Kansas City Approach to Modern Money Theory by L. Randall Wray. Section 4. Balance Sheet Consolidation and Coordination, or How the Government Really Spends. MMT has always recognized that the modern central bank sets the overnight rate target. In the United States, the Fed directly sets the discount rate at which it lends reserves and targets the Fed funds rate, at which banks lend reserves to one another. Before the global financial crisis, the Fed did not pay interest on reserves. But since the crisis, it has used the rate paid on reserves to set a floor to the Fed funds rate, while the discount rate acts as a ceiling. Central banks have discretion in determining how much the market rate, Fed funds rate in the United States, deviates from target. Previous to 1994, the Fed did not announce its target, so the market had to find it. Since the Fed now announces any changes to its target, the Fed funds rate moves quickly to the target. Some fluctuation still occurs, in part because some institutions that hold reserves do not have access to the discount window, so the Fed funds rate can be pushed above the discount rate ceiling. All of this is consistent with the post-Keynesian endogenous money and horizontalist views. What Mosler introduced was the idea that we should view Treasury bond sales as part of monetary policy, that is, as a reserve drain instead of a borrowing operation. MMT argues that all Treasury spending takes the form of a credit to bank reserves, with the receiving bank then crediting the deposit account of the recipient of government's spending. In a fractional reserve system, this creates excess reserves. Before the Fed paid interest on reserves, systemic excess reserves would place downward pressure on the Fed funds rate, and, if they were not relieved, the rate could fall toward zero. Bond sales lead to debits of bank reserves, relieving that pressure. Mosler's insight, as a bond trader, was that this is true whether the sale of bonds is by the Treasury, new issues, or by the central bank, open market sales. In either case, the function, removing reserves, is the same. Stephanie Bell Kelton and I had the good fortune of studying money and banking with John Randlett at California State University, Sacramento, albeit a couple of decades apart, and had been drilled in the T accounts of these operations, so immediately recognized that Mosler was correct. Footnote 25. See Randlett, 1977. End footnote. Government spending puts reserves into the banking system, while taxing and bond sales remove them. Why would we call it a fiscal borrowing operation when it is done by the Treasury, but a monetary policy operation when done by the central bank? In retrospect, this was completely missed by horizontalism. There was no discussion of the fiscal impact on reserves of spending, taxing, and bond sales by the Treasury. This is strange, indeed, as the impact of fiscal policy on bank reserves is normally orders of magnitude greater than the impacts of purely monetary policy operations by central banks. To be sure, the real-world operations are more complicated and involve a number of steps and institutional participants, including dealer banks, tax and loan accounts at special deposit banks, and treasury accounts at the central bank. For the purposes of simple exposition, MMT sometimes consolidates the Treasury and central bank into a government balance sheet, eliminating internal operations between them and ignoring some intermediate steps that involve the special banks. This has led to the creation of a sub-branch of post-Keynesian economics that accuses MMT of oversimplification. However, from the very beginning, MMT has sought to fully expose all the operational details, to a degree that had never been attempted by academic economists, and certainly not by post-Keynesians. Stephanie began this research when I was writing my 1998 book, and the details of coordination between the Fed and the Treasury were amplified by Stephanie Bell 2000 and later by Scott Fullwiler 2010 and Eric Timon 2016 for the United States and Philippe Rezende 2009 for Brazil. Footnote 26. I used Stephanie's 1998 manuscript while writing Chapter 5 of Wray 1998, pages 115 to 118. Her manuscript was published as Bell 2000. End footnote. However, as all this work demonstrates, the consolidation of the simplified model does not mislead, as the final balances remain the same no matter how deeply one goes into the intermediate steps. While orthodoxy and most heterodox economists argue that government faces a budget constraint similar to those faced by households and firms, MMT argues that the issuer of a currency faces no budget constraint other than the budget adopted by legislatures. The typical exposition presents the constraint as G equals T plus DB plus DHPM, where G is government spending plus interest payments on the debt. T is tax revenues, less transfers. DB is new bond issues, and DHPM is printing of high-powered money, new issues of cash plus reserves. Further, the method of finance is seen as a choice. Government chooses whether to use taxes, borrowing, or money printing to pay for the spending. Borrowing can push up interest rates and crowd out private borrowing and spending. Beyond some point, it increases default risk and can lead to insolvency. Money printing can cause inflation. MMT objects that this is an ex post identity, not an ex ante constraint. Further, the financing always takes the form of a credit to bank reserves and a credit by a private bank to the recipient's account. Government doesn't choose whether to use taxes, money, or bonds. Indeed, spending normally involves all three, even if the budget ends up balanced or in surplus at the end of the accounting period. This is due to self-imposed procedures adopted by the Treasury and Central Bank. There is no such thing as special deficit financing. Government is financed as it spends, with a deficit recorded only ex post. If the central bank pays interest on reserves, then it can choose whether to leave excess reserves in the banking system or to drain them through bond sales. Only in that sense can one say that there is a choice whether to use bonds or high-powered money. But that choice is made after the spending has occurred. Further, tax receipts over the course of a year are endogenously determined and highly pro-cyclical. They are not a discretionary choice to be used as a means of financing spending. Government deficits do not drive interest rates up, as in the crowding out in loanable funds stories. All else equal, they put downward pressure on the overnight interest rate as they lead to net credits of bank reserves. This was Mosler's original insight. Bond sales drain excess reserves to help the central bank keep interest rates from dropping below the target. It could be true that if the Treasury chooses to issue bonds of a particular maturity, that markets do not want to buy it could push up rates of that maturity. But that is a debt management mistake, not an inevitable outcome of deficits. Once the central bank pays interest on reserves, bond sales are no longer necessary for the purpose of maintaining target rates. They still may be needed because of operational procedures adopted. For example, the prohibition against central bank provisioning of overdrafts for the Treasury. In that case, a Treasury might sell new issues before spending, which requires that the central bank ensures banks have the reserves they will need to purchase the bonds. This is accomplished by lending reserves, or through open market purchases coordinated with the Treasury's new issue. However, the central bank can always remove the new bonds from markets through, for example, quantitative easing. After multiple rounds of trillions of dollars of quantitative easing, it should now be obvious that so far as inflation goes, there is no difference between leaving reserves in banks or draining them through bond sales. Reserves remain within the banking system and cannot get out to cause inflation havoc. All the excess reserves can do is to push the overnight rate to zero, or the support rate paid by the central bank. Quantitative easing was effectively a duration trade. It reduced the maturity of the government's outstanding debt, from longer-term bonds to reserves, lowering bank earnings. To the extent that central banks bought troubled assets, that is, uninsured mortgage-backed securities, this could have made an insolvent bank solvent. But unless government was ready to force such banks into resolution, this made very little difference to their operations. In short, as we argued from the beginning, quantitative easing was not likely to boost lending and spending, so by itself, asset purchases by the central bank would not be inflationary. Footnote 27. Some have argued that quantitative easing lowered interest rates, helping to boost asset market prices, which could indirectly generate spending and thus inflation. While it could be true that there were some marginal impacts on longer-term rates that did contribute to rising equity prices, the Fed could have just as easily lowered rates on long maturity bonds, simply by announcing it would stand ready to purchase them. In other words, it could have lowered the rates without actually buying the bonds and injecting reserves into banks. In any event, even the stock market recovery did not generate any significant increase of measured inflation, although asset market prices did rise. End footnote. This does not mean, however, that government spending cannot be too large or misdirected. But if it is the net spending that causes inflation, not the choice between borrowing or money printing. Too much private spending would similarly cause inflation pressures. As Stephanie Kelton is known to say, quote, "Cash registers don't discriminate between private and public spending." In any event, it is the too much spending, not the too much money, that presents an inflation danger. Exactly how the government spends is not issue of concern when it comes to inflation.